Okay, let's unpack this. Picture yourself on an ultimate getaway. You've got a gorgeous place all to yourself, incredible views, endless entertainment, all the food and drinks you could ever want, and every supply imaginable for your hobbies. Sounds like paradise, right?
Absolutely perfect on the surface.
Exactly. Now here's the catch. Complete isolation. No phone, no internet, zero human contact. You have absolutely everything you could desire except other people.
Hmm.
It's a strange thought, but for most of us, that dream vacation would likely become surprisingly stressful very quickly.
Yeah, that initial appeal would wear off fast, I think.
It really brings home a fundamental truth about us.
Yeah.
We humans are wired for connection, and at the very heart of that need are our intimate relationships.
What's truly significant is that these close relationships aren't just, a pleasant addition to life. They are genuinely essential for our well-being.
Right.
In this deep dive, we're going to explore the very bedrock of these crucial connections, focusing on friendships and romantic partnerships as key examples of intimacy between adults. We'll be drawing on research from behavioral science to understand how these relationships get started, how they function when they're healthy, what helps them flourish, and, yes, even the factors that contribute to their ending.
So the whole life cycle, really.
Pretty much. Our aim is to go beyond the typical portrayals we see and really get down to the core building blocks that shape our most intimate bonds.
Exactly. So what are these fundamental building blocks we'll be examining?
Well, our exploration will delve into the influence of the culture we live in, the profound impact of our past experiences,
Okay, culture, experience.
the significant role of our individual differences, things like our personalities and how we feel about ourselves, and even some fundamental aspects of our shared human nature that shape how we connect.
Human nature itself, interesting.
We'll also briefly touch on how we interact with each other, although that's a whole universe of its own that we can explore in more detail another time.
Right, interaction is huge.
And while our focus today is on understanding the foundations, it's worth remembering that there's also what could be called a dark side of relationships, which we'll be sure to investigate in a future discussion.
Definitely need to cover that too. But right now, let's really try to understand just why these close connections are so vital to us in the first place.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the first thing we need to do is clarify what makes an intimate relationship different from just any casual acquaintance.
Good point. Where's the line?
It's much more than simply knowing someone or interacting with them occasionally. Behavioral scientists have identified at least 7 key components that tend to characterize these close bonds.
7. Okay, let's hear them.
The first is what we call knowledge. Intimate partners share a deep and extensive understanding of each other.
Okay.
This often includes personal details, sometimes even confidential information that they wouldn't readily reveal to just anyone in their lives.
Right, it's that feeling of truly knowing someone at a really fundamental level, their history, their little quirks, what makes them tick on the inside.
Exactly. And this leads directly to the second component, interdependence.
Interdependence. Makes sense.
In an intimate relationship, our lives become intertwined. What one partner does has a direct effect on the other person, their plans, their feelings, their opportunities.
Yeah, you can't really separate things easily.
And this isn't just an occasional influence. It happens frequently, it's strong, meaning it has a significant impact, it's diverse, touching many different aspects of our lives, and it's enduring, lasting over a considerable period of time.
Wow. So frequent, strong, diverse, and enduring. That's quite a connection.
It really is. It's that constant reality that one person's actions create a ripple effect that touches both individuals in their relationship.
Okay, so we have knowledge and interdependence. What's next?
Building on that, the third key component is caring. Intimate partners simply feel more affection for each other, a deeper sense of warmth and regard than they typically do for most other people they know.
A special kind of affection.
Yes. Then comes trust, which is the expectation that your partner will treat you fairly and honorably.
Trust, that's huge.
Absolutely critical. It's believing that they have your best interests at heart and won't intentionally cause you undue harm.
And when that's broken.
Of course, when that trust is broken, a sense of wariness inevitably develops, and the openness and interdependence that are hallmarks of closeness tend to diminish.
Absolutely. Trust really is the bedrock on which strong, intimate relationships are built.
Couldn't agree more.
And the next piece of the puzzle is responsiveness.
Yes, responsiveness. This is when partners show that they truly understand, respect, and appreciate each other for who they are.
So it's about being seen and valued.
Precisely. They're attentive to each other's needs and welfare, and they respond effectively when their partner needs support or understanding.
It sounds incredibly rewarding.
It is. It's an incredibly rewarding experience to feel truly seen and supported by someone you're close to, and it's considered a core ingredient in the most fulfilling relationships.
So that's 5. Knowledge, interdependence, caring, trust, responsiveness. What else?
And because of these close ties and shared experiences, intimate partners begin to see themselves not just as two separate individuals, but as a unit, as a couple. This is mutuality.
Mutuality, the us factor.
Exactly. It's that shift in thinking from me and him, her, to a collective us.
Right.
Researchers have even developed a way to visually represent and measure this sense of shared identity called the inclusion of other in the self scale.
Oh, interesting. How does that work?
It's a simple but insightful visual measure where people are presented with a series of diagrams showing two circles that overlap to varying degrees.
Okay.
They then choose the diagram that best represents how much they feel their own identity overlaps with their partners.
Ah, I see. Like how much your lives and sense of self merge.
Precisely. It's been found to be surprisingly effective in distinguishing between intimate and more casual relationships.
That's a really helpful way to picture it. That gradual merging of two independent lives into something shared.
Hmm.
And finally, the 7th key component,
That would be
commitment, the long haul.
Yes. This involves the expectation that the partnership will continue indefinitely into the future.
It's not just about the present moment.
No, it also involves actively investing time, effort, and various resources to ensure that the relationship endures.
So it's an active process, not just a passive hope.
Absolutely. Without this sense of commitment, even relationships that were once very close can unfortunately drift apart over time, especially when challenges arise.
Makes sense. 7 components: knowledge, interdependence, caring, trust, responsiveness, mutuality, and commitment.
That's right. And it's really important to keep in mind that not every intimate relationship will have all 7 of these components present to the same degree at all times.
Right, it fluctuates.
Exactly. And the overall level of intimacy within a relationship can certainly fluctuate. For example, a marriage that has lasted for many years might have a very high degree of interdependence simply due to shared routines, possessions, and responsibilities.
Yeah, just practical stuff.
But it might unfortunately lack the same level of affection or responsiveness that was more prominent earlier in the relationship.
Like a relationship going a bit stale, maybe.
It can happen. However, the general consensus is that the most deeply satisfying and meaningful intimate relationships are typically those that encompass all 7 of these characteristics to a significant extent.
Great. Okay, so having all 7 firing is usually the goal for the most fulfilling connections.
Generally, yes.
So we've established what intimacy is by looking at its key components. But the next logical question is, why does it matter so profoundly in our lives?
Good question. This brings us to the need to belong theory.
The need to belong. Okay.
The central idea here is that as human beings, we possess a fundamental, deeply ingrained drive to form frequent, positive interactions with others in the context of lasting, caring relationships.
So it's not just a preference.
No, not just something that's nice to have. It's argued to be a basic psychological need that is essential for our normal psychological functioning and overall well-being.
Wow, essential. Like food or water.
Well, perhaps on a psychological level, yes. This theory posits that we need regular social contact with individuals with whom we feel a genuine sense of connection.
Regular contact, not just occasional.
Right. We are inherently driven to establish and then actively maintain these close relationships, requiring both interaction with and a feeling of communion, a sense of shared understanding and acceptance with those who know and genuinely care about us.
Interaction and communion. Both are needed.
Yes. Interestingly, the theory also suggests that we only need a relatively small number of these close relationships to satisfy this fundamental need.
Ah, so quality over quantity.
Definitely seems that way. Quality, in this case, definitely outweighs quantity. Furthermore, it appears that the specific identity of our partners might be less critical than the fact that they provide us with a consistent source of affection and acceptance.
So the function is key, maybe more than the specific person?
To some extent, yes. When one significant relationship ends, we often see people actively seeking out and forming new relationships that can fulfill this basic need to belong, even if these new partners are quite different from the person they've lost.
That makes sense. We try to fill that gap.
We do.
And there's quite a bit of compelling evidence that supports this idea of a fundamental need to belong, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Just think about how readily we tend to form new relationships, even in fleeting
Yeah,
situations.
like on a trip or a short course.
Exactly. And how strongly we often resist when those established social ties are threatened or disrupted. When a relationship that we value is going through a difficult time, it can become incredibly hard to focus on almost anything else in our lives,
Totally consumes your thoughts.
highlighting its central importance to our well being. Even that feeling of unease and stress we imagined at the beginning of our discussion, being completely alone for an extended period despite having all our material needs met,
Yeah, that thought experiment.
might very well stem from this deep-seated fundamental need for social connection.
Okay, so the drive is strong. What about the actual benefits? You mentioned well-being.
Perhaps some of the most striking evidence for the importance of intimacy comes from the observed biological benefits of having close social ties.
Biological benefits, like physical health.
Yes, exactly. Research has consistently shown that people who have strong social networks and satisfying close relationships tend to live happier lives, experience better physical health, and even live longer overall.
Longer lives, wow.
It's quite remarkable. For example, studies have found that simply holding the hand of a loved one can actually reduce the brain's neural response to perceived threats, indicating a powerful calming effect.
Just holding hands can do that.
It seems so. Incredibly, even our perception of physical pain can be lessened by simply looking at a photograph of a loving partner during a painful experience.
Looking at a photo helps with pain.
That's amazing. And perhaps most remarkably, research has even suggested that physical wounds can heal faster when individuals feel accepted and well supported by others in their social circle.
Faster healing. That really drives home the mind-body connection.
It really does.
Conversely, a lack of sufficient intimacy and social connection carries some significant risks for our health and well-being, I assume.
Definitely. People who experience chronic loneliness have been shown to have weaker immune responses, making them more susceptible to various illnesses.
Weaker immune systems.
Yes. Across the entire lifespan, individuals who report having few close friends or romantic partners, and even those who live in relative social isolation, tend to have significantly higher mortality rates.
Higher risk of dying sooner.
That's what the data suggests. One large-scale study, for instance, found that individuals with limited social connections were 2 to 3 times more likely to die over a 9-year period compared to those with stronger social networks.
2 to 3 times. That's a huge difference.
It is. Interestingly, even among those diagnosed with serious illnesses like cancer, married individuals have shown lower rates of death from the leading causes of cancer compared to their unmarried counterparts.
So connection even seems to help when facing major illness.
It appears to play a protective role, yes. And it's not just about the presence or absence of connections. The loss of close ties can also be quite detrimental.
Losing someone close.
Elderly individuals who experience the loss of a spouse, for example, are at a significantly higher risk of mortality in the initial months following their loss, a phenomenon that has been observed across different cultures.
That broken heart syndrome idea isn't just figurative then.
There seems to be a real physiological impact.
Yeah.
Similarly, research has linked divorce to an increased risk of early death in both men and women.
Divorce too. Wow.
Furthermore, the quality of our social connections plays a crucial role in our overall mental and physical health.
Ah, so it's not just having connections, but good ones.
Precisely. Pleasant social interactions and the feeling of being genuinely cared for are consistently associated with greater life satisfaction and overall well-being,
Makes sense.
whereas troubled or conflict-ridden relationships have been linked to a higher prevalence of psychiatric problems, including anxiety disorders and depression, as well as issues like substance abuse, chronic inflammation, obesity, and sleep disturbances.
So bad relationships can actually make you sick.
The evidence points strongly in that direction.
It's a complex picture though, right? I mean, it's certainly true that individuals who are already struggling with certain mental or physical challenges might find it more difficult to form and maintain loving relationships in the first place.
That's a very important point. The causality can be complex. However, the growing body of evidence increasingly suggests that a lack of intimacy and social connection can both contribute to the development of and exacerbate existing health problems.
So it likely works both ways.
It seems so. So whether you're young or old, regardless of your sexual orientation or living situation, our fundamental well-being seems to be deeply intertwined with our ability to satisfy this basic human need to belong.
It really does appear to be as essential to living a good and long life as our basic physiological needs like oxygen, food, and water.
That's a good way to put it. And now, to consider the external forces that shape the kinds of relationships we build to fulfill this innate need, we turn to a contrasting influence: culture.
Ah, culture. So moving from the innate need to how society shapes it.
Exactly. While our underlying need for intimacy may be a universal aspect of human nature, the specific norms, expectations, and accepted patterns surrounding our close relationships are anything but fixed and unchanging. They are heavily influenced by the culture in which we live.
Absolutely. If we just take a moment to think back to, say, 1965,
A good reference point.
a time when many of our grandparents might have been embarking on their marriages, the prevailing cultural landscape around intimate relationships was remarkably different from what we see today.
Night and day in some respects.
Back then, the norm was for people to marry relatively young, typically in their early 20s.
Very common then.
Living together before marriage, or cohabiting, was an extremely rare occurrence and carried a significant social stigma in many communities.
Definitely not the norm.
Similarly, having a baby outside of the bonds of marriage was also quite uncommon, with the vast majority of children being born to parents who were legally married.
Much less frequent statistically.
Furthermore, it was much more likely that mothers of young children would primarily stay home to care for their families rather than participate in the workforce outside the home.
The traditional model was much more prevalent.
And sadly, perhaps, it was also more common for children to grow up in households with both their biological parents present throughout their childhood.
Higher rates of intact families, statistically speaking.
Fast forward to the present day, and the picture looks incredibly different across many of these dimensions.
The shifts have been dramatic. Over the past several decades, the cultural context in which we form and maintain our close relationships has undergone some truly significant changes.
Yeah,
For many individuals of our grandparents' generation, the changes we observe now in how people approach relationships would likely be quite astonishing.
I can imagine. What are some key stats now?
Well, in the United States, for example, fewer people are choosing to get married than ever before in recorded history.
Fewer than ever.
While in 1965, it was almost a universal expectation that adults would eventually marry, demographers now predict that a significantly lower percentage of young adults will ever tie the knot.
A lower percentage ever getting married.
That's the prediction. And this trend of declining marriage rates is even more pronounced in many European countries.
Interesting.
When we take into account those who are divorced, widowed, or have simply never married, less than half of the adult population in the U.S. is currently married, an all-time low in available data.
Less than half currently married. That's a major shift.
It really is.
And when people do decide to get married, they're typically waiting much longer to do so than in previous generations, right?
Yes, absolutely. The average age for a first marriage for both men and women has steadily increased and is now at a record high,
Record high age.
with a significant proportion of individuals reaching their mid-30s without ever having been married.
Mid-30s unmarried is much more common now. It really makes you consider how our societal views on being single and the timing of marriage have also evolved quite considerably.
Indeed. We also see cohabitation, that is, unmarried couples living together in a romantic relationship, as a routine and widely accepted occurrence now,
Yeah, totally normal for many people.
something that was quite rare and often frowned upon in 1965. A substantial portion of adults under the age of 44 have now experienced cohabitation at some point in their lives.
Under 44.
And in fact, the number of people in this age group who have cohabited is now greater than the number who have ever been married.
More have cohabited than married. That's incredible.
It's just a fundamental shift, and perhaps one of the most striking changes relates to childbearing outside of marriage.
Right, that's changed a lot too.
In 1965, it was a relatively uncommon event. Now, a substantial and growing percentage of babies are born to mothers who are not legally married,
A big jump.
and on average, women in the U.S. have their first child at an age that precedes their first marriage.
First baby before first marriage on average.
Yes, as a direct consequence of these shifts, a significant proportion of children today spend at least some part of their childhood living with a parent who is not married to their other parent.
And we certainly can't overlook the high rates of divorce that have characterized recent decades.
True, although there's some nuance there. While there has been a slight decrease in divorce rates among college graduates in more recent years,
Okay, a decrease for some.
overall, the rate of marital dissolution remains considerably higher than it was for our grandparents' generation. Statistically speaking, a couple getting married today faces a higher likelihood of experiencing a divorce at some point in their marriage than the likelihood of staying together happily for the rest of their lives.
Higher chance of divorce than lifelong happiness. That's sobering.
It is a stark statistic. Finally, the traditional family structure has shifted dramatically, with the majority of preschool-aged children now having parents who both work outside the home,
Dual income families are the norm now.
representing a major change from the more common pattern in 1965, where one parent, typically the mother, would stay home to care for young children.
So huge shifts across the board. Marriage rates, age, cohabitation, kids outside marriage, divorce, working parents.
Exactly. These remarkable statistical shifts clearly indicate a fundamental change in our shared cultural assumptions about the institutions of marriage and parenthood.
How so?
Marriage has increasingly become viewed as more of a personal choice, something that individuals may or may not pursue even when children are involved.
Less of an obligation, maybe.
Perhaps. Consequently, more people are either choosing to delay marriage until later in life or foregoing it altogether. And even when people do marry, there seems to be a less strong emphasis on the idea of it being an unbreakable, lifelong commitment, as was perhaps more prevalent in earlier generations.
The till death do us part idea feels less absolute for some.
It seems that way culturally. The cultural norms that once strongly encouraged people to get married and then to stay married through thick and thin have undergone an enormous transformation in recent years.
And these broad cultural changes have some very real and tangible implications for our individual relationships, don't they?
Absolutely. Cultural standards really act as a foundational framework for our expectations and relationships, shaping what we consider to be normal, desirable, and acceptable.
Like setting the default options.
In a way, yes. Let's take the significant rise in cohabitation as a prime example. Many young adults today hold the belief that it's a sensible and even advisable step to live together with a romantic partner before getting married.
Yeah, the test drive idea.
Right. The reasoning often includes the desire to spend more quality time together, to share the often significant burden of living expenses, and perhaps most explicitly, to test their long-term compatibility before making the more formal commitment of marriage.
Seems logical on the surface.
This widespread belief has undoubtedly contributed to the fact that cohabitation has become a very common stage in the progression of romantic relationships for many people.
But does the test drive actually work? Does it lead to better marriages?
Well, the research findings on the link between premarital cohabitation and subsequent marital success are quite interesting and perhaps counterintuitive to some of these common beliefs.
Oh, how so?
Studies actually suggest that for couples who do not already have firm plans to marry at the time they begin cohabiting.
So, not engaged yet.
Right. For those couples, living together beforehand does not necessarily increase the likelihood of having the successful marriage down the line.
It doesn't help.
Not necessarily. In fact, some research has even indicated an association between premarital cohabitation without a clear commitment to marriage and an increased risk of later divorce.
Increased risk. Why would that be?
There are several potential explanations that have been proposed. On average, couples who cohabit without firm marriage plans tend to start living together at younger ages than those who marry directly.
Younger age, okay.
Perhaps more importantly, these cohabiting couples often exhibit lower levels of commitment to one another compared to couples who choose to marry without first living together.
Lower commitment, like keeping options open.
Yeah, possibly. By essentially keeping their options more open, these relationships might be characterized by more underlying uncertainty, potentially leading to more problems and disagreements, as well as lower levels of overall satisfaction and trust between the partners.
More conflict, less trust.
Some studies have even reported higher rates of conflict, jealousy, infidelity, and even instances of physical aggression in cohabiting relationships compared to those where couples marry without prior cohabitation.
Wow.
Suggesting that these cohabiting relationships might be inherently more tumultuous and volatile.
It's fascinating to see how the long-term trajectory of cohabiting relationships can differ from that of marriages.
It really is. Research suggests that the longer couples cohabit without a clear commitment to marriage, the less enthusiastic they tend to become about the prospect of marriage itself.
Less keen on marrying over time.
That's the trend observed. They also appear to develop a greater acceptance of the possibility of divorce as an outcome for romantic relationships in general.
More accepting of divorce.
Some studies have even shown that after a certain period of cohabitation, around 5 years, Couples who have not married are just as likely to break up as they were in the initial stages of living together.
No increased stability over time.
Not in those cases, it seems. Marriage, on the other hand, tends to follow a different pattern. The longer a couple remains married, the lower the statistical likelihood of them experiencing a divorce.
So marriage seems to build stability over time, but maybe not cohabitation without commitment.
That appears to be the case. This contrasting trend seems to suggest that engaging in casual cohabitation with the primary intention of testing compatibility might inadvertently undermine the very positive attitudes towards marriage and the strong determination to work through challenges that are often considered crucial for long-term marital success.
So the act of testing might actually weaken the foundation for commitment.
That's one interpretation of the findings. It's also important to make a distinction between different types of cohabiting relationships, though.
Right, not all cohabitation is the same.
Exactly. Research indicates that couples who are already engaged to be married when they decide to move in together tend to fare significantly better in terms of their relationship satisfaction and eventual marital success compared to those who cohabit without any specific plans for marriage.
Okay, so being engaged makes a difference.
It does seem to. However, even among engaged couples who cohabit, some studies have suggested that they tend to report slightly lower levels of overall happiness in their relationships compared to couples who choose to marry directly without first living together.
Still a bit less happy than marrying directly. Interesting.
Furthermore, in contemporary society, cohabiting partners are actually less likely to ever get married compared to cohabiting couples in the past.
Less likely to marry at all now.
Yes, suggesting that for some, cohabitation may serve as an alternative to marriage rather than a stepping stone towards it.
So cohabitation as an end in itself, for some couples.
That seems to be happening more often. The widespread acceptance of cohabitation as a sort of trial run for marriage is therefore a likely contributing factor to why we are observing fewer marriages overall and shorter durations of marriage compared to previous generations like 1965.
Okay, that makes sense. The rise of cohabitation is a big piece of the cultural puzzle. So what are the major driving forces behind these really significant cultural shifts we've been discussing overall?
Well, economics certainly play a significant role.
Money matters. How so?
Research has shown that more industrialized and affluent societies tend to have a greater proportion of single individuals, higher divorce rates, and a later average age of marriage.
More wealth, later marriage, more divorce. Interesting correlation.
As societies undergo greater socioeconomic development, individuals often gain more financial independence and have more options in terms of lifestyle and relationship choices.
Less economic dependence on a partner.
Exactly. Women in particular are less likely to feel a strong economic necessity to marry if they have their own independent financial resources and career opportunities.
Financial independence for women changes the equation.
Definitely. We're also observing a notable shift away from the more traditional model of the male as the sole breadwinner in a family, with a growing number of wives now earning as much as or even more than their husbands, further altering the economic dynamics within relationships.
Right, the breadwinner model is much less common. So economics is one driver. What else?
Another really significant influence on the changing landscape of relationships is the rise of individualism in many Western cultures.
Individualism. Focus on the self.
Yes. There is an increasing societal support for self-expression, personal autonomy, and a greater emphasis on individual fulfillment and happiness.
Seeking personal satisfaction more.
Compared to previous generations, people today tend to place a higher value on materialistic possessions and perhaps show a decreased level of concern for the well-being of others within their communities.
More focus on me and my stuff.
That's one interpretation of the trends. This increased focus on personal happiness and gratification may lead to higher expectations for the level of personal satisfaction derived from intimate partnerships, perhaps seeking more pleasure and being less willing to make significant sacrifices or compromises than earlier generations might have been.
Higher expectations for personal happiness from a relationship.
Yes. If a relationship becomes unsatisfying on a personal level, there may be a greater sense of justification in ending it in order to pursue contentment elsewhere.
Easier to justify leaving if you're not personally fulfilled.
A significant contrast to the previous societal norms that often emphasized staying together for the sake of the children or other external factors.
Right, the reasons for staying have shifted.
It's also interesting to note that cultures that place a greater emphasis on a more collective sense of self and prioritize group harmony tend to have significantly lower divorce rates compared to more individualistic societies.
So collectivist cultures have lower divorce rates. Makes sense. Economics, individualism. What else is changing things? Technology has also emerged as a major catalyst for change in the realm of intimate relationships.
Ah, technology. Huge impact.
Modern reproductive technologies have provided women with greater control over their fertility and have also made it possible for single women to have children outside of traditional marriage, altering the traditional link between marriage and procreation.
Right. Separating sex, marriage, and babies more easily.
Consequently, we've seen declines in birth rates in some industrialized countries, and the widespread availability and use of emergency contraception have further contributed to this trend.
Furthermore, modern communication technologies have fundamentally altered the way in which we initiate, maintain, and even end our relationships.
Oh yeah, smartphones, social media,
Unlike previous generations, we now have near constant connectivity through mobile phones, the internet, and various social media platforms.
always reachable, or expected to be.
This has led to the development of new dynamics and expectations around communication within relationships, such as the perceived appropriate frequency of texting, the interpretation of online activity, and the expectation of immediate responsiveness.
New rules of engagement, basically.
Yes. The advent of phenomena like sexting has also introduced new complexities and potential risks into the intimate sphere.
Definitely adds a new layer. And social media specifically.
Social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter have also had a profound impact on our relationships. While they can certainly help us to satisfy our basic need for social connection by allowing us to stay in touch with friends and family,
The upside.
they also create a whole new set of dilemmas and considerations within intimate partnerships.
Like what?
For example, the decision of when and how to make a relationship Facebook official can carry significant weight and be interpreted differently by partners.
Oh yeah, the relationship status update drama.
Conflicts and feelings of jealousy can arise from a partner's interactions and connections on social media.
Seeing who they're liking or following.
Even the public nature of breakups and the lingering digital traces of past relationships can add layers of complexity to navigating our intimate lives in the digital age.
Yeah, hard to escape the past online sometimes.
We're also seeing the emergence of phenomena like technoference, where our technological devices frequently interrupt our face-to-face interactions with loved ones.
Technoference.
Yeah,
Like phone interruptions during dinner.
exactly. And phubbing, the act of snubbing someone in a social setting by focusing on your phone instead of them.
Phubbing. I've seen that word. Snubbing someone with your phone.
Research has even suggested that simply having a smartphone present during an in-person conversation, even if it's not being actively used, can negatively impact the quality of that interaction and the level of closeness felt by the participants.
Just having it on the table hurts the connection. Wow.
It seems to create a subtle barrier.
Okay. Economics, individualism, technology, any other major cultural drivers.
Finally, a more subtle but nonetheless important influence on broader relationship norms is the sex ratio within a given culture. That is, the relative number of men compared to women in the population.
Sex ratio, how does that affect things?
Societies that have a high sex ratio, meaning there are more men than women, tend to support more traditional gender roles, emphasize female domesticity, exhibit greater sexual conservatism, and often discourage social behaviors like unwed pregnancy and divorce.
More men, more traditional norms.
That's the general correlation observed historically. Conversely, cultures with a low sex ratio, where there are fewer men than women,
Fewer men.
tend to be less traditional and more permissive in their social norms, with women more likely to pursue careers outside the home and greater societal acceptance of sexual activity outside of marriage.
Fewer men, more permissive norms, more women in careers.
Generally, yes. Historical examples, ranging from ancient Rome to Victorian England and the period of the sexual revolution in the 1960s, provide compelling illustrations of this link between the sex ratio and prevailing cultural attitudes towards relationships.
So history shows this pattern.
It does. The current demographic situation in China, with a significant and concerning scarcity of young women due to historical factors, provides a contemporary example of how a dramatic imbalance in the sex ratio can exert a powerful influence on cultural norms and, consequently, on the nature of intimate relationships within that society.
Right. The situation in China is a major example of this.
Absolutely.
So what we can clearly see is that while our fundamental need for close connections might be a deeply ingrained aspect of our human nature, the cultural context in which we pursue and experience those connections is far from static.
It's constantly shifting.
It's constantly evolving, shaped by a multitude of economic, social, and technological forces, and it significantly influences our expectations, our behaviors, and ultimately the very nature of our intimate partnerships.
Well said.
Now, let's shift our focus inward and consider another crucial building block: the profound influence of our individual experiences on our relationships.
Indeed. Our personal histories, the unique set of experiences we bring to our interactions with others, play a vital and often underestimated role in shaping the kinds of relationships we form and how we behave within them.
Our baggage, basically.
Well, perhaps a more neutral way to put it is our learned patterns. A prime example of this powerful influence is the concept of attachment styles,
Attachment styles, I've heard of those.
which represent our relatively stable global orientations toward close relationships. The origins of this theory lie in developmental research, particularly the groundbreaking work focusing on how infants develop different patterns of emotional attachment to their primary caregivers, most often their mothers.
So it starts really early, with babies and moms.
That's where the initial research focused, yes.
Mm.
Initially, the understanding was that children who consistently received reliable care, protection, and emotional support from their caregivers developed what was termed a secure attachment style.
Secure attachment got consistent care.
Right. These children learned that others were trustworthy sources of security and kindness, and they felt comfortable seeking support when needed.
Makes sense.
In contrast, children whose care was unpredictable, inconsistent, or neglectful often developed anxious, ambivalent attachments.
Anxious, ambivalent, unpredictable care.
Yes. These children tended to exhibit fretful feelings, nervousness in relationships, and a clingy dependence on their caregivers.
Clingy and nervous.
Okay. Finally, children who experienced rejecting, dismissive, or even hostile care often developed avoidant attachments,
Avoidant, rejecting care.
characterized by a sense of suspicion towards others and a difficulty in forming trusting, close emotional bonds.
Suspicious. Keeps distance.
The fundamental idea was that these early experiences in infancy and childhood laid down a kind of blueprint that would significantly shape the individual's approach to and expectations in all subsequent relationships throughout their lives.
A blueprint for future relationships, based on the first one.
That was the core idea. This foundational idea gained significant traction when researchers extended the concept of attachment styles to the realm of adult romantic relationships.
So applying it to adults.
Yes. One influential study demonstrated that similar attachment orientations could be readily observed in adults. These researchers found that a majority of adults reported feeling generally relaxed and comfortable with emotional intimacy, and depending on their romantic partners, indicating a secure attachment style.
So most adults felt secure, like the babies.
A majority, yes. However, a substantial minority reported feeling insecure in their relationships, either struggling with issues of trust and dependence on others, or experiencing persistent worry about the potential for their relationships to end.
The insecure patterns carried over too.
It seems so. Importantly, this study also found significant correlations between these adults' self-reported current attachment styles and their recollections of their childhood experiences with their parents.
So their adult style matched their childhood memories.
There was a strong link. Adults with secure attachment styles tended to have positive memories of their upbringing and viewed their parents as loving and supportive,
Secure adults, positive memories.
while those with insecure attachment styles were more likely to view others with uncertainty or distrust and to remember their parents as being inconsistent, emotionally distant, or cold.
Insecure adults, negative or uncertain memories. Got it.
This initial research spurred a deeper and more nuanced exploration of adult attachment, and later theorists proposed a more differentiated four-category model that refined the understanding of the avoidant attachment style.
Okay, refining the categories. What are the four now?
This model retained the concept of a secure attachment style, consistent with the initial findings.
Secure is still secure.
Right. However, the anxious ambivalent style was further elaborated and relabeled as preoccupied.
Preoccupied instead of anxious ambivalent. Why preoccupied?
It better reflects the characteristic worry and preoccupation with the status of one's relationships, often stemming from a deep-seated dependence on others' approval for their own sense of self-worth.
Constantly thinking about the relationship status. Makes sense.
The avoidant category was then divided into two distinct subtypes: fearful and dismissing.
Okay, avoidance splits into fearful and dismissing. What's the difference?
Fearful individuals exhibit a strong desire for closeness and intimacy, but simultaneously avoid it due to an underlying fear of rejection and being hurt.
Want closeness, but afraid of rejection.
Okay.
So conflicted.
Exactly. They want to be liked and accepted by others, but deeply mistrust them. Dismissing individuals, on the other hand,
The other avoidant type.
tend to downplay the importance of intimacy altogether, often feeling that close relationships simply aren't worth the effort and potential complications.
Intimacy isn't worth it.
Pretty much. They prioritize their own independence and self-sufficiency and report not being particularly concerned with the opinions or feelings of others.
Independent, self-sufficient, maybe a bit detached.
That captures the essence of the dismissing style.
So the four are secure, preoccupied, fearful, and dismissing.
Correct. And it is now widely accepted within the field that two fundamental underlying dimensions effectively differentiate these four adult attachment styles.
Two dimensions underlying the fourth style.
Yes. Avoidance of intimacy and anxiety about abandonment.
Avoidance and anxiety, okay.
The dimension of avoidance of intimacy represents a spectrum ranging from feeling completely comfortable and relaxed in close relationships at one end to being deeply distrustful and emotionally distant at the other.
Comfort versus distance.
And the second dimension, anxiety about abandonment, also exists on a continuum, from feeling securely comfortable with closeness and interdependence to experiencing a persistent dread of being found unworthy of love and ultimately being left by significant others.
Security versus fear of being left.
Exactly. The secure attachment style is characterized by low levels on both avoidance of intimacy and anxiety about abandonment.
Secure, low avoidance, low anxiety.
The preoccupied style involves low avoidance of intimacy but high anxiety about abandonment.
Preoccupied, low avoidance, high anxiety.
Yeah.
Wants closeness, but worries.
The fearful attachment style is marked by high levels on both avoidance of intimacy and anxiety about abandonment.
Fearful, high avoidance, high anxiety. Wants closeness, but fears it, and fears being left.
And finally, the dismissing attachment style features high avoidance of intimacy but low anxiety about abandonment.
Dismissing, high avoidance, low anxiety. Doesn't want closeness, not worried about being left.
That maps it out well.
While these four distinct labels can provide a very useful and accessible framework for understanding different relational patterns, it's important to remember that attachment is more accurately viewed as existing along these two continuous dimensions, rather than as belonging to one of four rigidly defined categories.
That's a crucial point. It's really a spectrum. Most people in the United States tend to identify themselves as having a secure attachment style.
Most are secure, okay.
Although the proportion of securely attached individuals is often found to be somewhat lower among college student populations.
Lower among students. Any idea why?
Potentially due to being in a transitional life stage, maybe more relationship exploration and uncertainty happening. Attachment style distributions can also vary across different countries and cultures.
Culture matters here too.
With some studies suggesting that insecure attachment styles may be more prevalent than secure ones in certain populations. Interestingly, research has also indicated a generally positive trend over the lifespan.
Good news.
Yes, people tending to become less anxious and less avoidant in their attachment styles as they age and accumulate more relational experiences.
So we can become more secure over time.
It seems many people do. Ultimately, what we can conclude is that these attachment styles represent relatively stable orientations towards close relationships that are largely learned through our cumulative experiences in those relationships.
Largely learned through experience. That's key.
Examining the development of attachment styles more closely, it becomes clear that a complex interplay of factors is at work.
Nature versus nurture again.
To some extent. While babies are indeed born with different temperaments, which can subtly influence how their parents interact with them.
Right, some babies are fussier than others.
Our experiences, particularly in early childhood, appear to play a significantly larger and more direct role in shaping our attachment styles.
Experience trumps temperament, mostly.
It seems to have a stronger influence. The level of acceptance or rejection that we consistently receive from our primary caregivers during those formative years is a crucial influence.
Acceptance versus rejection from parents.
For example, research has shown that expectant mothers who report feeling happy and positive about their pregnancy are more likely to have toddlers who exhibit secure attachment patterns.
Wanted pregnancies linked to secure toddlers.
Similarly, mothers who themselves report feeling comfortable with emotional intimacy tend to be more attuned, responsive, and sensitive in their caregiving behaviors.
Secure moms raise secure kids, often.
Which in turn fosters secure attachment in their children. Even targeted interventions that provide training to mothers of irritable or fussy babies, focusing on how to be more sensitive and consistently responsive to their infants' needs,
Parenting training.
have been shown to significantly increase the likelihood of secure attachment developing in those children.
So parenting skills can make a real difference, even with challenging babies.
Absolutely. Furthermore, the impact of parenting styles can extend well beyond early childhood. The kind of parenting adolescents receive has been found to be a significant predictor of their relationship behaviors and attachment patterns in their adult romantic relationships and even their friendships, sometimes decades later.
Parenting in teen years affects adult relationships years later.
Ah,
Wow, long-lasting
yes,
effects.
indeed.
However, and this is a really important point to emphasize, we are absolutely not prisoners of our early childhood experiences, are we?
No, definitely not. That's crucial. Our attachment styles, while often quite stable, are not set in stone, and they can and do continue to evolve and change based on our experiences in adult relationships.
So adult experiences can change our style.
Yes. Just as these patterns are learned over time, they can also be, to some extent, unlearned or modified.
How?
For instance, over time, a consistently supportive, loving, and trustworthy romantic partner can help someone with a more avoidant attachment style gradually become less wary of emotional intimacy and more comfortable with dependence.
A good relationship can make someone more secure.
It certainly can. Conversely, unfortunately, a particularly painful or negative breakup experience can sometimes cause a person who was previously secure in their attachment style to feel more anxious and insecure in subsequent relationships.
And a bad breakup can make someone less secure.
It can shape their foundations.
Mhm.
Our attachment style towards a specific partner might even fluctuate somewhat from day to day, depending on the specific interactions and emotional climate of the relationship at any given time.
It can even change day to day.
Minor fluctuations, yes. The encouraging news is that individuals who consciously recognize their own insecure attachment patterns and actively want to become less anxious or avoidant in their relationships often succeed in making positive changes through self-reflection, therapy, or positive relational experiences.
So change is possible if you work at it.
Very much so.
Despite this very real potential for change and growth, it's also true that once established, attachment styles can exhibit a significant degree of stability over time, right? They don't just vanish.
That's true. They can even lead individuals to unconsciously seek out and create new relationships that tend to reinforce their existing attachment tendencies.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Sometimes, yes. For example, someone with a fearful attachment style due to their fear of rejection might avoid getting too close to others, never fully learning to trust, and thereby inadvertently reinforcing their own fearful style of relating.
Their avoidance prevents them from learning trust.
Exactly. In the absence of significant new relational experiences that challenge these ingrained patterns, attachment styles have been shown to persist relatively consistently over periods of decades.
Stable over decades.
They can have a considerable impact on long-term relationship outcomes. For example, individuals who are securely attached tend to report having happier and more stable marriages,
Secure people, happier marriages.
while those with insecure attachment styles are statistically more likely to experience divorce or remain single.
Insecure people, higher chance of divorce or being single.
That's what the trends show.
So what we can conclude is that our fundamental beliefs and expectations about close relationships are profoundly shaped by our experiences within those relationships, starting with those very early interactions with our primary caregivers.
Yes, starting early.
These early experiences can set us on a particular relational path, whether it's one characterized by trust and comfort or by fear and avoidance. While later experiences in our adult partnerships certainly have the potential to alter that course, our learned styles of attachment nonetheless exert a powerful and often unconscious influence on how we navigate our intimate connections.
Building upon our understanding of how past experiences shape our relationships, we now turn our attention to another critical set of building blocks: the influence of individual differences.
Okay, individual differences beyond attachment.
Yes. Beyond the overarching patterns of attachment that we develop, our unique combinations of personal characteristics, traits, and attributes also play a very significant role in determining the nature and quality of our intimate partnerships.
Makes sense, we're all unique.
We will be exploring 5 key types of individual variation that have been found to be particularly relevant in the context of relationships.
5 types. Okay, what are they?
Sex differences, gender differences, sexual orientations, personality traits, and the all-important factor of self-esteem.
Sex, gender, orientation, personality, self-esteem. Got it. Let's start with sex differences.
All right. Let's begin our exploration of individual differences by considering sex differences. It's a common trope in popular culture to talk about men and women as being fundamentally different.
Yeah, the men are from Mars, women are from Venus idea.
Exactly that. Sometimes even leading to the humorous, albeit inaccurate, assertion that they are from different planets. However, when we look at the scientific evidence, the reality turns out to be far more nuanced than these simplistic stereotypes suggest.
Usually is more nuanced.
While it's certainly true that human traits and behaviors vary widely across individuals, when we examine how these traits are distributed within the populations of men and women, we typically observe what's known as a normal curve, or a bell-shaped distribution.
The bell curve. Most people in the middle, fewer at the extremes.
Right. This means that for most traits, the majority of people, regardless of their sex, tend to fall somewhere around the average, and individuals exhibiting extreme levels of a particular trait are relatively rare.
So men and women aren't two totally separate groups on most traits.
Generally not. What's particularly interesting and often surprising is that many of the popular stereotypes about profound differences between men and women often exaggerate the reality quite significantly.
Stereotypes exaggerate. Shocking.
Perhaps not. These stereotypes tend to depict men and women as possessing almost entirely separate and non-overlapping ranges of interests, abilities, and emotional responses.
Like two different species sometimes.
However, a vast body of research consistently demonstrates that actual sex differences in most psychological traits tend to take the form of overlapping normal curves.
Overlapping curves. That's the key image.
It's a crucial point because it indicates that while there might indeed be statistically significant average differences observed between the sexes on certain traits,
The averages might differ slightly.
there is also typically a very substantial amount of overlap in the distribution of those traits between men and women.
Meaning lots of women are higher than the average man on some male traits, and vice versa.
Precisely. For example, it's been found in numerous studies that men, on average, tend to report a slightly higher level of sexual drive compared to women.
Okay, average sex drive higher for men.
However, if we were to look at the entire range of sex drive scores for both men and women, we would see a significant amount of overlap. This means that there are many women who report a higher sex drive than many men, even though the average for the male group is somewhat higher.
The overlap is big.
Yes. Researchers often use a statistical measure called the D statistic to quantify the size of these group differences.
The deed statistic measures the size of the difference.
In the realm of sexual attitudes and behavior, for instance, some research has found small average differences in the age at which men and women report having their first sexual intercourse, with men tending to be slightly younger on average.
Small difference there.
Medium-sized differences have been observed in behaviors like masturbation frequency, with men, on average, reporting higher rates.
Medium difference for masturbation.
However, perhaps surprisingly, large-scale comprehensive analyses of sexual attitudes and behaviors have generally failed to find any substantial large differences between men and women in the majority of areas studied.
Mostly small or medium differences, very few large ones in sexuality.
That's what the comprehensive data suggests. These findings highlight three really vital points that are important to keep in mind when considering psychological sex differences.
Okay, 3 key takeaways.
First, while some average differences between men and women are indeed real and have been consistently observed in research, these differences tend to be small to medium in magnitude for most psychological traits.
Real, but mostly small to medium.
It's crucial to remember that just because a difference between two groups is found to be statistically significant in a research study, it does not automatically mean that the actual difference is large or practically meaningful in everyday life.
Significant doesn't always mean big. Good point.
Second, and perhaps even more importantly, the range of behaviors, opinions, and experiences within each sex is almost always vastly greater than the average difference that we might observe between the sexes.
More variation within men and within women than between men and women on average.
Exactly. To illustrate this, think again about the example of attitudes towards sexual permissiveness. While men, as a group, might score slightly higher on average in terms of their acceptance of casual sex, there is still a huge amount of variability in these attitudes among men themselves, ranging from very conservative to very liberal.
Lots of different views among men.
In fact, an individual man who is quite conservative in his views on sex might actually have more in common in his attitudes with the average woman on this trait than he does with another man who holds very liberal views on casual sex.
So grouping by sex hides huge individual variation.
It certainly can. Third, the significant degree of overlap between the distributions of traits in men and women inevitably means that there will always be a substantial number of individuals of one sex who will score higher on a particular trait than the average score of the other sex.
Lots of crossover.
So if you were looking for a partner or a friend with a specific characteristic, it's far more effective to focus on that individual's unique qualities rather than relying on broad and often inaccurate generalizations based solely on their sex.
Look at the person, not the label. Makes sense.
The fundamental takeaway here is that when it comes to most of the dimensions that are relevant to our interpersonal relationships, men and women are far more similar to each other than they are different.
More similar than different. That's the bottom line on sex differences.
For most relationship-relevant traits, yes. The popular notion of men and women coming from completely different planets with fundamentally opposing needs and desires in relationships is simply not supported by the weight of scientific evidence.
So, ditch the Mars-Venus idea.
Pretty much. In the vast majority of cases, the individual differences that exist within each sex are much more pronounced and ultimately more influential in shaping our interpersonal interactions than are the relatively small, average differences that we might find between men and women as groups.
Individual differences matter more than sex differences.
Generally, yes. Now, to add another layer of complexity to our understanding, it's essential that we distinguish between the concepts of sex differences and gender differences.
Okay, sex versus gender. What's the distinction here?
While sex differences, as we've been discussing, primarily refer to the biological and physiological distinctions between males and females,
Biology, sex.
gender differences encompass the social and psychological distinctions that are created and reinforced by our cultures and through the processes of upbringing and socialization.
Culture and upbringing. Gender.
For instance, a clear biological sex difference is the fact that women have the biological capacity to be mothers and men to be fathers.
Biological reality.
However, the widely held belief that women are inherently more loving, nurturing, and skilled at childcare than men is a reflection of a gender difference.
A learned belief, not biology.
As many men are perfectly capable of exhibiting great tenderness, compassion, and effective parenting skills, societal expectations, cultural norms, and the different ways in which we tend to raise boys and girls from a very young age often blur the lines between underlying biology and socially constructed gender roles.
Society teaches us gender roles.
It plays a huge role.
Yeah.
It's also really important to recognize that our individual experiences and expressions of gender are far more complex and fluid than a simple binary categorization of male or female.
Gender isn't just male-female.
Not for everyone, and maybe not as simply as we assume. An individual's gender is influenced by a multifaceted array of factors,
Like what?
including the sex they were assigned at birth based on biological characteristics, their own deeply felt sense of gender identity, which may or may not align with their assigned sex,
Assigned sex versus gender identity.
the prevailing social norms and expectations within their culture regarding how people of different genders should behave, how they choose to outwardly present their gender to others through appearance and behavior,
Social norms.
presentation.
And their own personal preferences and judgments regarding their own gender and the genders of others.
It's complex.
Very. Contemporary surveys even indicate that a significant percentage of people identify as genderqueer, actively rejecting the traditional binary notion of male and female as the only valid gender categories.
Gender queer identity.
Hmm.
Rejecting the binary.
Furthermore, even among individuals who identify as cisgender, meaning their gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth, many report sometimes feeling like the other sex or even wishing they had the physical body of the other sex.
Even cisgender people can have complex feelings.
This inherent complexity suggests that gender is perhaps best understood not as a fixed category, but rather as a spectrum with a wide range of possibilities and individual experiences.
Gender is a spectrum, not a box. That seems a more accurate representation. So, understanding the distinction between biological sex and socially constructed gender is absolutely crucial, especially in the context of relationships.
Why, especially for relationships?
Because many of the influential differences we observe between men and women in their relational behavior, these gender differences are largely learned through the processes of socialization rather than being directly determined by underlying biological factors.
Learned behaviors are key in relationships.
Yes. The most readily apparent examples of this are our societal gender roles,
Gender roles again.
which are the culturally expected patterns of behavior that are considered appropriate and normal for men and women within a given society. Men are often expected to embody masculine traits, being assertive, self-reliant, decisive, and competitive.
the typical masculine script.
While women are frequently expected to exhibit feminine traits such as being warm, sensitive, emotionally expressive, and kind.
The typical feminine script.
While the specific content and rigidity of these gender role expectations can vary considerably across different cultures and historical periods, the general phenomenon of socially constructed gender roles is widespread.
It happens everywhere, just differently.
It's important to remember that most of these behaviors associated with masculinity and femininity are learned through social interaction, observation, and reinforcement, rather than being inherited biological imperatives.
Mostly learned, not born with.
However, it's really crucial to remember that these broad gender stereotypes don't accurately describe every single individual.
Stereotypes are inaccurate, we know that.
In reality, a significant proportion of people are what we call androgynous,
Androgynous, what does that mean exactly?
meaning that they possess a notable blend of traits traditionally considered both masculine, like assertiveness and self-reliance, and feminine, like warmth and sensitivity.
A blend of both masculine and feminine traits.
Exactly. Instead of fitting neatly into either the masculine or feminine box, they embody qualities stereotypically associated with both genders.
More flexible.
In the context of relationship research, scholars often use the terms instrumental traits to refer to the traditionally masculine task-oriented talents and skills, such as assertiveness, independence, and competence,
Instrumental, task-oriented, masculine.
and expressive traits to describe the traditionally feminine social and emotional skills, like warmth, empathy, and sensitivity.
Expressive, social, emotional, feminine.
It's really about having a broader and more flexible range of interpersonal skills and abilities, regardless of one's sex.
So anyone can have these skills.
Indeed. Instrumentality and expressiveness are best understood as two separate and independent sets of skills and personality characteristics that can range from low to high in both women and men.
Two separate scales.
Traditional gender roles often tend to portray women as being high in expressive traits, but relatively low in instrumental traits, and conversely, men as being high in instrumental traits, but lower in expressive ones.
And stereotypes again.
Androgynous individuals, on the other hand, are characterized by exhibiting high levels of both instrumentality and expressiveness.
Androgynous high on both.
Interestingly, research suggests that a significant minority of people actually fall into categories where they are either high in the skills typically associated with the other sex, termed cross-typed,
Cross-typed, high on the other gender's traits.
or relatively low in both sets of skills, referred to as undifferentiated.
Undifferentiated, low on both.
Just as we saw with biological sex differences, it's simply inaccurate and overly simplistic to think of men and women as entirely distinct groups with completely separate and opposing sets of personality traits and interpersonal skills.
Lots of people don't fit the stereotypes at all.
A significant number don't. These socially constructed gender differences are particularly interesting and important for those who study relationships because, rather than necessarily fostering greater compatibility between partners,
You'd think different roles might complement each other.
one might think that, but they can actually contribute to misunderstandings and even incompatibility in intimate relationships.
How so?
For example, research has shown that individuals who adhere to more traditional gender roles tend to report less enjoyment and liking of each other from the very first time they meet compared to individuals who exhibit more androgynous traits.
Traditional people like each other less initially.
Compared to androgynous people meeting? Yes. Furthermore, couples in which both partners strongly adhere to stereotyped masculine and feminine gender roles often report lower levels of overall marital satisfaction over time compared to couples with more flexible gender role orientations.
Less happy marriages for traditional couples over time. Why?
This might be because intimate partnerships often thrive on qualities like mutual affection, emotional warmth, and deep understanding.
The stuff relationships need.
Qualities that individuals who are particularly low in expressive traits may not readily provide to their partners.
If you're low on expressiveness, like traditional men often are, it's hard to provide that warmth and understanding.
That's a crucial point to emphasize. People who find themselves in intimate relationships with partners who are consistently low in expressiveness tend to report lower levels of satisfaction in those relationships.
Less satisfaction with low expressive partners.
This pattern has been observed across a variety of different cultures, ethnicities, and even in both heterosexual and same-sex partnerships. Traditionally masculine men, in particular, often report experiencing lower quality in their romantic relationships compared to men who are more comfortable expressing a wider range of emotions and engaging in more expressive behaviors.
Traditional men report lower relationship quality.
In fact, adherence to very rigid and traditional gender roles can actually disadvantage men by limiting their emotional vocabulary and inhibiting their ability to seek and provide emotional support, potentially even negatively impacting their physical and mental health in the long run.
It hurts the men themselves, too.
It can. Conversely, individuals who are low in instrumentality, lacking assertiveness, independence, and a sense of personal strength tend to report lower levels of self-esteem and poorer overall psychological adjustment.
Low instrumentality hurts self-esteem and adjustment.
In traditional gender roles, this might disproportionately affect women, potentially hindering their educational and career accomplishments and negatively impacting their long-term financial well-being.
So being low on masculine traits can hold women back financially and psychologically.
Can present challenges, yes.
Ultimately, what research strongly suggests is that both instrumentality and expressiveness are highly valuable sets of traits for navigating the complexities of life and interpersonal relationships.
Both are good to have.
And individuals who possess a healthy balance of both tend to be the happiest, best adjusted, and most effective in a variety of social contexts.
The androgynous ideal seems beneficial.
Androgynous partners, who can be both assertive and warm, independent and caring, are often particularly well suited for fostering satisfying and equitable intimate relationships.
It makes sense. It's interesting to note, for example, that even in childhood and adolescence, sensitive and emotionally expressive boys tend to have a greater number of close female friendships, highlighting the value of these feminine traits across genders.
Expressive boys have more girlfriends, shows the appeal.
It's somewhat ironic, then, that societal pressures often discourage individuals from fully embracing and expressing traits that fall outside the narrow confines of traditional gender roles.
Society pushes us into boxes.
With these expectations often being even stricter and more rigidly enforced for men than for women.
Stricter rules for men's gender expression.
Often, yes. While societal views are slowly but steadily moving towards more egalitarian and flexible understandings of gender, the often inaccurate and limiting stereotypes associated with traditional gender roles continue to persist and can significantly complicate the formation and maintenance of close, fulfilling relationships.
Do gender stereotypes still cause problems, even if things are changing slowly?
They certainly do. Shifting gears once again, let's now consider the profound influence of personality as another highly significant individual difference that shapes our relationships.
Okay, personality traits. How do they fit in?
Unlike attachment styles, which can evolve over time with new experiences, and gender, which is largely shaped by societal and cultural forces, core personality traits tend to be more stable and enduring influences on our relational patterns throughout our lives.
Personality is more stable than attachment or gender roles.
Generally, yes, with only gradual and subtle changes typically occurring over very long periods.
Okay, so what personality traits matter most for relationships?
The big five personality traits are generally considered by psychologists to represent the fundamental dimensions of personality that are universal across cultures.
The big five.
Right.
Openness, conscientiousness,
Yes. Open-mindedness, being curious and imaginative. Conscientiousness, being organized and dependable. Extroversion, being outgoing and sociable. Agreeableness, being cooperative and compassionate. And negative emotionality, being prone to experiencing negative emotions like anxiety and anger.
openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and negative emotionality, sometimes called neuroticism.
Got it. Research has consistently shown that individuals who score higher on the traits of extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and open-mindedness tend to experience greater satisfaction and happiness in their interpersonal relationships.
So 4 out of 5 are generally good for relationships.
They tend to correlate positively, yes. Extroverted people are generally more sociable and enjoy interacting with others. Agreeable people tend to be more cooperative, kind, and considerate. Conscientious people are typically more responsible, organized, and dependable. And open-minded individuals are often more imaginative, curious, and willing to try new things.
All sound like good qualities in a partner. What about the 5th one, negative emotionality?
Well, of these big five personality traits, one that has consistently emerged as particularly influential in the context of close relationships is negative emotionality.
The tricky one.
Individuals who score high in negative emotionality tend to be more prone to experiencing negative emotions, such as anxiety, sadness, and anger.
More anxious, sad, angry.
This can often lead to more touchy, pessimistic, and argumentative interactions within their relationships.
Makes relationships harder, I'd imagine.
It really can. Longitudinal studies that have followed couples over many years have even found that the initial level of negative emotionality reported by individuals when they were engaged to be married can be a significant predictor of their marital satisfaction decades later.
Negative emotionality when engaged predicts satisfaction decades later. Wow, powerful effect.
It seems to be quite significant. Overall, the research strongly suggests that having a partner who is generally optimistic, positive in their outlook, and emotionally stable is a significant predictor of long-term relationship happiness and stability.
Choosing someone low on negative emotionality is a good bet for happiness.
The odds seem better, yes.
Are there other personality traits beyond the big five that matter?
Yes, absolutely. Beyond the broad Big Five personality traits, there are also other more specific personality characteristics that have been found to play a role in the quality of our relationships.
Such as?
For example, unselfishness, being attentive to the needs of one's partner, being generous, and being perceived as trustworthy, is a highly attractive quality in a relationship,
Unselfishness, definitely attractive.
and can even have some interesting long-term benefits for individuals who possess it. Research suggests that unselfish individuals tend to have more children and even higher incomes over their lifespan.
More kids and higher income for unselfish people. Interesting.
Another important trait is humility,
Humility.
which is characterized by a lack of excessive entitlement, an honest acceptance of one's own limitations, and a willingness to be forgiving of others' mistakes.
Not arrogant, aware of flaws, forgiving.
Humble individuals tend to be easier to live with and are generally preferred as potential dating partners.
Easier to be around. Makes sense.
There are also other specific personality characteristics that are relevant to relationships that we will likely discuss in more detail in future deep dives, such as an individual's tendency to enjoy casual sex or their level of self-control.
Okay, more specific traits for later. Does personality change at all?
While our underlying personality traits do have a genetic basis to some extent, it's also true that our experiences within our relationships can have a minor influence on shaping certain aspects of our personality over time.
Relationships can slightly change personality.
Minor influences, yes. However, the general consensus in the field is that our pre-existing personality traits tend to exert a stronger influence on the nature and quality of our relationships than the reverse.
Personality affects relationships more than relationships affect personality.
That seems to be the stronger direction of influence. While we do tend to see some general trends in personality development as we age, such as increases in conscientiousness, agreeableness, and emotional stability during adulthood,
We tend to mature a bit.
our individual differences in these core personality traits tend to remain relatively stable over the course of our lives.
But how we compare to others stays pretty consistent.
Generally, yes.
Okay, our next critical individual difference to consider is self-esteem.
Ah, yes, self-esteem,
Yeah.
which, in its most basic sense, refers to our overall evaluation of our own worth as a person.
How much we like ourselves.
Essentially, high self-esteem reflects generally favorable judgments and positive feelings about ourselves, while low self-esteem is characterized by self-doubt, negative self-perceptions, and a lack of confidence in our own value.
High versus low. Pretty clear.
While it's a commonly held assumption that having high self-esteem is inherently good and beneficial in all aspects of life,
We usually think high self-esteem is always better.
the sociometer theory offers a slightly different and perhaps more nuanced perspective on the function of self-esteem, particularly in the context of social relationships.
Sociometer theory, what's that?
This theory proposes that our self-esteem acts as a kind of subjective gauge or internal monitor of the quality of our relationships with others.
Like a fuel gauge for relationships.
That's a great analogy. According to this view, when we believe that others like and value us, our self-esteem tends to be high, signaling that our social connections are strong and secure.
Feel like high self-esteem.
Conversely, when we feel disregarded, excluded, or devalued by others, our self-esteem tends to dip, alerting us to potential problems in our social standing.
Feel rejected, low self-esteem.
Sociometer theory suggests that this mechanism of tracking social acceptance through our feelings of self-esteem evolved as a fundamental way to serve our basic need to belong, which was crucial for survival and reproduction in our ancestral past.
So self-esteem evolved to help us stay connected.
That's the core idea of the theory.
Is there evidence for this sociometer idea?
There's quite a bit of interesting evidence that supports it. For example, studies have shown that people tend to feel better about themselves and experience a boost in self-esteem when they believe they are perceived as attractive or desirable by others.
Feeling attractive boosts self-esteem. Okay.
Conversely, experiences of social rejection or criticism tend to have a more negative impact on our self-evaluations. In fact, research suggests that interpersonal rejection, such as being excluded by a social group or experiencing a romantic breakup,
Social rejection.
tends to damage our self-esteem more profoundly than other types of disappointments or failures that are not directly related to our social connections.
Rejection hurts self-esteem more than failing at a task.
It often seems to. Even the impact of public events on our self-esteem seems to be greater than that of private events, further suggesting that our sense of self-worth is closely tied to how we believe we are perceived and valued by the people around us.
What others think really matters for our self-esteem.
It's a powerful reminder that we are fundamentally social beings, and our sense of self is deeply intertwined with our connections to others.
Makes sense.
It's often quite difficult for individuals to maintain a consistently positive self-image if they do not believe that the people in their lives generally like and value them.
Hard to like yourself if you think nobody else does.
Consequently, individuals with chronically low self-esteem have often developed these negative self-evaluations as a result of a history of not feeling sufficiently accepted, appreciated, or loved by the important people in their lives.
Low self-esteem often comes from past rejection.
That's often the case. Interestingly, even when individuals with low self-esteem do manage to form new relationships with partners who are kind, supportive, and express genuine appreciation for them,
So even in a good relationship.
their underlying low self-esteem can sometimes lead them to engage in behaviors that unintentionally sabotage the very relationships they desire.
Sabotage.
For instance, they might tend to underestimate the depth of their partner's love and commitment, or be more likely to interpret neutral or even positive behaviors as signs of disregard or rejection.
Doubting their partner's love. Seeing rejection where there isn't any.
Exactly.
Research has shown that individuals with low self-esteem tend to overreact to their partner's occasional bad moods or minor criticisms, feeling significantly more rejected and angry than those with higher self-esteem might in the same situation.
More sensitive to negativity.
These heightened negative feelings can then lead to less constructive and more defensive responses to perceived threats in the relationship, such as withdrawing emotionally or becoming overly critical themselves,
Pushing the partner away defensively.
which can unfortunately further reinforce their own negative self-perceptions and create a negative cycle within the relationship.
A downward spiral.
The underlying psychological dynamic seems to involve a persistent struggle to balance the fundamental need for close connection with a more powerful and often unconscious need for self-protection.
Connection versus self-protection.
For individuals with low self-esteem, the fear of potential rejection or being hurt in a relationship can sometimes take precedence over nurturing the very intimacy they crave, even when they are with a loving and devoted partner.
Fear wins out over connection.
This can manifest in a variety of ways within a relationship, from making minor disagreements seem like major crises to constantly being hypervigilant for any subtle signs of potential rejection,
Making mountains out of
and
molehills.
misinterpreting small everyday issues as indicators of a partner's waning commitment. Individuals with low self-esteem may also seek reassurance from their partners, but often in ways that are less effective or even off-putting,
Like demanding reassurance constantly.
such as constantly demanding proof of love or becoming overly needy. Even their online behavior, such as posting more pessimistic updates on social media or engaging in fewer social interactions online, can reflect their underlying insecurity.
Even shows up on Facebook.
This is in stark contrast to individuals with high self-esteem, who tend to be more secure in their partner's regard and are generally more likely to shrug off minor relationship bumps and disagreements without catastrophizing.
High self-esteem folks bounce back easier.
Unfortunately, low self-esteem can be a relatively enduring characteristic and can be difficult for individuals to overcome, often persisting even after many years of marriage and negatively impacting the satisfaction of both partners in the relationship.
It can be hard to shake.
However, there is some encouraging news on this front, isn't there?
Yes, definitely. Research suggests that when devoted partners recognize their lover's underlying insecurity and low self-esteem, they may consciously increase their expressions of affection, reassurance, and positive regard,
So a loving partner can help.
which can, over time, potentially help to boost their partner's self-esteem and foster a more secure sense of self-worth.
That's hopeful.
Additionally, studies have shown a general trend of self-esteem increasing gradually from young adulthood through middle age for many individuals.
Self-esteem tends to go up as we get older.
For many people, yes, suggesting that our self-evaluations are not necessarily fixed and can improve over time.
Good to know.
Ultimately, the evidence strongly suggests that self-esteem both results from and actively steers the course of our interpersonal relationships.
It's a two-way street.
Our fundamental concept of who we are is deeply intertwined with our connections to others, and these self-evaluations, in turn, significantly shape how we approach and behave within our future interactions.
Okay, that covers self-esteem. Finally, as we round out our discussion of individual differences, we come to the topic of sexual orientation.
Right, and while it's a significant aspect of individual identity, it's important to state upfront that sexual orientation itself doesn't fundamentally alter the basic dynamics of intimacy in close relationships.
The core relationship stuff is the same regardless of orientation.
That's the main message from the research. Sexual orientation is a complex construct encompassing an individual's self-identified sexual orientation, their patterns of sexual attraction, and their actual sexual behaviors.
Identity, attraction, behavior.
And these three aspects don't always perfectly align for every person.
They don't always match up.
Research has shown that many individuals who identify as heterosexual have nonetheless experienced same-sex attractions or fantasies at some point in their lives. Furthermore, sexual orientation is increasingly understood as existing on a continuum rather than as a set of rigid, mutually exclusive categories of heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual.
A continuum again, not strict boxes.
Exactly.
What about prevalence?
On a global scale, the majority of people identify as heterosexual. However, research suggests that women are slightly more likely than men to identify as bisexual, while men are slightly more likely to identify as exclusively homosexual.
Some slight gender differences in identification patterns.
Yes. While societal attitudes towards same-sex relationships have undergone significant positive changes in many parts of the world in recent decades.
Then it's getting better.
Individuals in LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual relationships still often face unique stressors and challenges related to their minority status, such as experiences of social disregard, disapproval, and discrimination, which heterosexual couples typically do not encounter.
Minority stress is still a factor.
Unfortunately, yes. Despite these external pressures, however, the fundamental nature of intimacy and connection within LGBT relationships is remarkably similar to that observed in heterosexual relationships.
So internally, the relationships function similarly.
Very much so. Across a wide range of relationship-related topics, such as the patterns of attachment that individuals form with their partners, the preference for having a partner who is emotionally expressive, the subjective experience of falling in love,
All the core stuff.
the perceived benefits of being in a committed partnership, and the presence of both passionate feelings and relationship doubts and commitments, research has consistently found resounding similarities between same-sex and other-sex couples.
The similarities are overwhelming.
They really are.
There are, of course, some average differences that have been observed between same-sex and heterosexual couples in certain areas, right?
Yes, some average differences exist. For instance, gay men, on average, tend to exhibit higher levels of emotional expressiveness compared to heterosexual men.
Gay men more expressive on average.
And lesbians tend to report higher levels of instrumentality compared to heterosexual women,
Lesbians more instrumental on average.
which may contribute to the finding that same-sex couples often demonstrate less rigid adherence to traditional gender roles within their relationships.
Less tied to traditional gender roles in same-sex couples. Makes sense.
Additionally, individuals in same-sex relationships tend to have, on average, higher levels of education and hold more liberal social and political views.
Some demographic differences?
Some observed behavioral differences between same-sex and heterosexual couples, such as the frequency of sexual activity in the early stages of a relationship, might actually be more closely related to the sex of the partners involved.
Depends whether it's two men or two women.
It's due to average biological differences in sex drive between men and women, rather than to their sexual orientation itself.
So it might be about sex drive differences, not orientation.
That's a plausible explanation for some findings. What's particularly noteworthy is that in areas where functional differences in relationship dynamics have been identified through research,
Where there are differences.
gay and lesbian couples often tend to report having, on average, better and more satisfying relationships compared to heterosexual couples.
Better relationships on average for gay and lesbian couples. How so?
This includes things like a more equitable division of household labor and responsibilities, more open and effective communication patterns, and a greater respect for individual differences between partners, which can lead to less frequent and less intense conflict.
Fairer chores, better communication, less conflict. Sounds good.
Any notion of inherent flaws or weaknesses in same-sex relationships compared to heterosexual ones has been consistently refuted by empirical research.
No basis for thinking same-sex relationships are somehow flawed.
None whatsoever based on the science.
What about bisexual individuals? You mentioned LGBT, but is their experience different?
Bisexual individuals, however, do tend to report lower levels of overall relationship satisfaction on average compared to both heterosexual and homosexual individuals.
Lower satisfaction for bisexuals. Why might that be?
It may be due to a variety of complex factors, including the fact that many bisexual individuals end up partnered with someone of the other sex, who may or may not fully understand or share their bisexual orientation.
Partner might not get it.
They may also face suspicion or even outright rejection from both heterosexual and homosexual individuals within their social networks.
Prejudice from both sides. That's tough.
Additionally, bisexual individuals tend to have lower rates of disclosing their sexual orientation to others compared to gay or lesbian individuals. Unfortunately, bisexual individuals have also reported experiencing harsh criticism and negative judgments from some members of the lesbian and gay communities.
Criticism even from within the LGBTQ+ community.
Sadly, that has been reported. However, when bisexual individuals do experience comfortable and accepting intimacy within a relationship,
When they find acceptance.
research suggests that the level of satisfaction derived from that intimacy is just as high as it is for individuals of any other sexual orientation.
The potential for satisfaction is just as high.
Absolutely. Ultimately, the fundamental principles and components of a healthy and fulfilling intimate relationship appear to be the same, regardless of the sexual orientation of the individuals involved.
The bottom line is, intimacy works the same way for everyone.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests.
Okay, that covers individual differences. Now, let's shift to our last major building block, the influence of human nature itself.
Right. Finally, we turn our attention to the potential influence of human nature itself, exploring the possibility of universal themes and tendencies in our close relationships that reflect our shared evolutionary history and the pressures that shaped our species over countless generations.
So going back to our evolutionary roots,
Exactly. The field of evolutionary psychology offers a framework for understanding how our psychological traits and behaviors, including those related to mating in relationships, may have evolved as adaptations that enhanced our ancestors' survival and reproductive success.
okay, evolution's take on relationships. What are the core ideas?
One of the fundamental assumptions of evolutionary psychology is that the process of sexual selection has played a key role in shaping many of the characteristics that we see in our species today, including our preferences in romantic partners and our relationship behaviors.
Sexual selection. Survival of the sexiest, basically.
That's a catchy way to put it.
Yeah.
It's important to distinguish sexual selection from natural selection, which primarily focuses on traits that enhance an individual's survival. Sexual selection, on the other hand, emphasizes traits that increase an individual's reproductive success.
Passing on genes.
That is, their ability to attract mates, successfully reproduce, and ultimately leave behind more descendants. From this evolutionary perspective, fundamental human motivations, such as the deep-seated need to belong that we discussed earlier,
That need to belong again.
likely became prevalent because they were adaptive in our evolutionary past. For early humans, being part of cooperative social groups would have significantly increased their chances of survival.
Safety in numbers, shared resources.
For example, through shared resources, protection from predators, and assistance in raising offspring, and, consequently, their reproductive opportunities.
Better survival and reproduction in groups.
Over time, these tendencies to seek out and maintain social bonds, including intimate relationships, could have become heritable psychological mechanisms that are now a fundamental part of our shared human nature.
So the need to belong is wired in by evolution.
That's the argument. Evolutionary principles suggest that these kinds of universal psychological mechanisms exist today because they provided significant survival or reproductive benefits to our ancestors.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Another core idea in evolutionary psychology is that sex differences in psychological traits and behaviors should primarily arise in those specific domains where men and women historically faced different adaptive challenges and reproductive dilemmas.
Sex differences evolved only where reproductive challenges differed.
That's the hypothesis. In most aspects of close relationships, we would expect to see more similarities than differences between the sexes, reflecting our shared human needs and the common challenges of social living.
Similarities should be the norm.
However, differences might be more pronounced in areas where specialized behaviors or preferences would have significantly improved an individual's access to mates or the survival of their offspring.
Except where mating or parenting strategies differed.
Precisely. A classic example used to illustrate this point is the hypothetical difference in the number of children that a man versus a woman could potentially father or bear in a single year,
The theoretical limits on reproduction.
highlighting the significant disparity in the minimum biological investment required for reproduction.
This leads to the concept of obligatory parental investment, right?
Exactly. Obligatory parental investment refers to the basic time, energy, and resources that a parent must provide to their offspring in order for those offspring to survive and eventually reproduce themselves.
The minimum needed to raise a kid successfully.
In most mammalian species, including humans, there is a significant difference in the level of obligatory parental investment between males and females.
How so for humans?
For men, the minimum biological investment required to produce offspring can be relatively small, a single act of fertilization. This theoretical capacity might have historically allowed men to potentially father a large number of children with different partners over a relatively short period.
Low minimum investment for men.
For women, however, the obligatory parental investment is considerably higher, involving pregnancy, childbirth, and often a period of lactation and intensive caregiving.
High minimum investment for women.
This greater biological investment naturally limits a woman's reproductive potential in terms of the number of offspring she can bear in a given time frame.
So, fewer potential offspring for women. How does this affect mate selection, according to the theory?
Evolutionary psychology suggests that these fundamental differences in obligatory parental investment may have led to the evolution of different mate selection strategies in men and women.
Different strategies evolved.
The theory posits that women in our ancestral past who were more careful and selective in their choices of sexual partners were likely to have had greater reproductive success.
Choosier women had more surviving kids.
That's the idea. By choosing mates who were more likely to invest resources in them and their offspring, they would have increased the chances of their children surviving and thriving.
Choosing providers.
Consequently, evolutionary perspectives suggest that women today may tend to be more selective than men in their choice of sexual partners, often prioritizing traits that might signal a partner's ability and willingness to provide resources and support,
So women look for resources and stability.
such as intelligence, friendliness, social status, and emotional stability, and perhaps showing less overall interest in casual, uncommitted sexual encounters.
Less interest in casual sex. More selective overall.
That's the predicted pattern.
What about other evolutionary pressures, like paternity uncertainty?
Ah, yes. Another key difference highlighted by evolutionary psychology relates to the issue of paternity uncertainty.
Men can't be 100% sure a kid is theirs biologically.
Exactly. While a woman is always biologically certain whether or not a child she bears is her own, men in heterosexual relationships have historically faced a degree of biological uncertainty regarding whether a child is truly theirs.
Mama's baby, papa's maybe.
That phrase captures the concept. Evolutionary theorists suggest that this fundamental difference may be one of the reasons why men, on average, tend to express greater concern and experience more negative emotional reactions to a partner's sexual infidelity compared to women.
Men more upset by sexual cheating.
Even though research indicates that women actually report engaging in infidelity less frequently than men,
Interesting. So the uncertainty drives the jealousy.
that's one evolutionary explanation proposed.
What about different mating strategies? Short-term versus long-term.
Right. Evolutionary psychology also makes a distinction between short-term and long-term mating strategies, suggesting that both men and women may employ different criteria and preferences when seeking a partner for a brief, casual encounter versus a committed long-term relationship.
Different criteria for flings versus marriage.
Research has explored these potential gender differences in mate preferences for both types of relationships. In general, studies tend to show that men express a greater desire for short-term sexual liaisons and report a greater readiness to engage in sexual activity with new partners compared to women.
Men more interested in short-term, quicker to have sex.
That's the general finding. When considering short-term partners, men may be more attracted to cues associated with sexual availability. However, when seeking long-term partners,
For marriage material.
men also report valuing traits traditionally associated with chastity or fidelity, as well as placing a relatively high value on physical attractiveness and youth in a long-term mate.
Long-term, men value fidelity, looks, youth.
Some research has even suggested that men may seek wives who are younger than themselves, potentially as a cue to greater reproductive potential.
That's preference for younger wives.
What about women's preferences? Do they differ for short versus long term?
Women's mate preferences, according to this perspective, also tend to differ depending on whether they are considering a short-term or long-term partner.
Okay.
For short-term mating, perhaps particularly in the context of extramarital affairs, women may be drawn to men who exhibit traits like being physically attractive, charismatic, dominant, and possessing good genes.
Short term, women look for sexy traits or good genes.
That's the theory. However, when evaluating potential long-term
For the
partners,
long haul.
women tend to place a significantly higher priority on traits that suggest good financial prospects, access to resources, and a willingness to invest in the relationship and any potential offspring,
Long term, women prioritize resources and commitment.
even if those partners are less physically attractive. In general, research supports the idea that women place greater importance on the financial prospects and social status of their long-term partners compared to men's reported preferences.
Status and resources matter more to women for long term partners.
These patterns of mate preferences, shaped by the long legacy of evolutionary pressures faced by our ancestors, continue to subtly influence our desires and behaviors in contemporary relationships, often operating beneath the level of conscious awareness.
As one prominent researcher in this field eloquently put it, we are all living with the lasting mental and emotional legacy of these powerful evolutionary pressures that have shaped our species over millennia.
A powerful legacy.
Understanding these fundamental evolutionary underpinnings can provide valuable insights into some of the enduring patterns and potential sources of conflict that we observe in our intimate relationships today.
So as we wrap up this initial exploration into the fundamental building blocks of our intimate relationships, it becomes really clear that our closest connections are shaped by an incredibly diverse and interconnected array of factors.
So many influences.
We've examined how broad societal norms and expectations, the unique personal experiences that each of us carries, our individual personalities and characteristics, and even our shared evolutionary history all contribute to the complex tapestry of our intimate lives.
Culture, experience, individual differences, human nature, all playing a part.
Gaining a deeper understanding of these fundamental elements can be truly invaluable as we navigate the often challenging but ultimately rewarding process of forming, maintaining, and sometimes even ending these crucial bonds that play such a vital role in our overall well-being and happiness.
This leads us to a really important point for you to think about. As you've listened to our discussion today, considering the various influences we've explored, culture, personal experience, individual differences, and our shared human nature,
All those building blocks.
which of these do you personally believe has the most profound and perhaps often unconscious impact on your own relationships?
Good question for reflection.
And more importantly, why do you think so? We really encourage you to take some time to reflect on the information we've presented and to consider its relevance to your own past, present, and future intimate relationships.
Definitely some food for thought there. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the foundational elements of intimate relationships. We truly hope that this exploration has provided you with some valuable insights.
And to help solidify your understanding, let's briefly highlight some of the key terms we've discussed.
Okay, a quick recap of terms.
First, intimacy. This refers to that multifaceted quality distinguishing close relationships from casual ones, characterized by those components like mutual knowledge, interdependence, caring, trust, responsiveness, mutuality, and commitment.
Got it. Intimacy.
Then the need to belong. That's the fundamental human motivation for frequent, positive interactions and lasting, caring relationships, essential for our well-being.
Need to belong. Crucial.
Culture. Those shared assumptions, norms, and values shaping expectations and defining what's normal in relationships in a given society.
Culture's influence.
Cohabitation. Simply living together without being married. We talked about its prevalence and impact on later marriage.
Cohabitation.
Sex ratio. The number of men for every 100 women influencing cultural relationship norms.
Sex ratio.
Attachment styles. Those global orientations toward relationships secure, preoccupied, fearful, dismissing, learned largely from early experiences, affecting comfort with intimacy and anxiety about abandonment.
Attachment styles. Very important.
Sex differences. The biological distinctions between men and women.
Sex differences. Biology.
Gender differences. The social and psychological distinctions created by culture and upbringing.
Gender differences, social cultural.
Gender roles. Culturally expected behaviors for normal men, often instrumental, and women, often expressive.
Gender roles, expectations.
Androgyny. Possessing both traditionally masculine, instrumental, and feminine, expressive traits.
Androgyny. The blend.
Big five traits. Those fundamental personality traits. Open-mindedness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, negative emotionality, influencing relationship quality.
Big five. Personality.
Self-esteem. Your overall evaluation of your worth. Sociometer theory links it to the quality of our relationships.
Self-esteem. The sociometer.
Sexual orientation. That complex aspect of identity including self-definition, attraction, and behavior existing on a continuum.
Sexual orientation. Continuum.
Evolutionary psychology. The perspective looking at traits and behaviors as adaptations shaped by natural and sexual selection for survival and reproduction.
Evolutionary psychology.
Obligatory parental investment. The minimum time, energy, resources needed for offspring, differing between men and women, potentially influencing strategies.
Parental investment.
And finally, paternity uncertainty. The biological uncertainty men face regarding fatherhood.
Paternity uncertainty. Key evolutionary concept. Great recap. And here's a brief summary of the key points we covered in this deep dive.
Okay, the big picture.
First, intimate relationships have those 7 core components and fulfill our fundamental need to belong, impacting our health significantly.
Intimacy and the need to belong are vital.
Second, cultural norms have changed dramatically due to economics, individualism, technology, and sex ratios, influencing marriage, cohabitation, and more.
Culture shapes relationships profoundly.
Third, early experiences shape attachment styles, which influence later relationships, though change is possible.
Experience and attachment matter, but aren't destiny.
Fourth, individual differences like sex, gender, personality, especially negative emotionality, self-esteem as a sociometer, and sexual orientation all play roles. Remember, sex differences are often smaller than stereotypes suggest. Gender is largely learned, and androgyny can be beneficial.
Our unique traits shape our interactions.
And fifth, an evolutionary perspective suggests universal needs and differing reproductive pressures have shaped some relationship tendencies and mate preferences.
Human nature leaves its mark. And to help you think about how these concepts might apply to your own life, here are some suggestions for satisfaction.
Practical takeaways.
First, take some time to reflect on the 7 key components of intimacy in your own closest relationships. Which feel strong, which could maybe use some attention.
Assess your own relationships.
Second, consider how cultural norms might be influencing your expectations and choices. Are these norms serving you well, or do they need questioning?
Examine cultural influences.
Third, think about your own attachment style. Do you see patterns of security, anxiety, or avoidance? Recognizing it is the first step to addressing any issues.
Understand your attachment style.
Fourth, assess your own personality traits, especially negative emotionality. How might these impact your relationships?
Reflect on your personality.
Fifth, pay attention to your self-esteem and how it might affect your perceptions of your partner. Are you underestimating their regard due to insecurity?
Monitor your self-esteem's impact.
Sixth, remember the diversity of sexual orientations and the fundamental similarities in intimacy across different partnerships.
Appreciate diversity and similarity.
And finally, reflect on potential evolutionary influences on your desires and behaviors. But remember, our modern context is very different from our ancestral past.
Consider evolutionary echoes, but critically. Thank you again for diving deep with us today. We hope you found this exploration insightful.